Morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Fulton, and I'm a podcast producer at the Globe Content Studio.
Hi, and I'm Kiran Rana. I am the executive producer of podcasts at the Globe Content Studio.
So I have a quick poll. Please raise your hand if you listen to a podcast anytime in the last month. All right, wow, great. Keep your hands up if you listen to a podcast in the last week. And keep your hand up if you would say that listening to a podcast is pretty much built into your day-to-day life at this point. Amazing. Sean, if I could get you to give me some assistance with the throw mics. Someone who had their hand up. Daily podcast listening is something that you do. Hands up, please. Amazing.
Should I randomly?
Yeah, should we randomly select somebody?
All right.
Put you on the spot? Would you mind saying your name and just a podcast that you listened to in the last week that you thought was great?
My name is Michelle Platt. I work for App Innovation, and I listened to Pod Crushed yesterday.
Yeah. And what did you like about that? One thing you liked about the show?
Pen bagging.
Okay.
No, basically, just great. I like their content. Their content's really varied, so they do like a little bit of mini session in the beginning, and then they have an actual person that they interview, and it's nostalgia for me, basically.
That's great. That's great. Maybe one more person who listens to podcasts every day. Oh, thanks, Daya. If you could just say your name and a podcast that you really like.
So Bridget and B-Video, and I listened to the Succession podcast on the way here.
Whoa.
Love it. So good. Yeah, Kara Swisher. It's really fun.
Amazing. So I think it's fair to say the two things that those two podcasts had in common, you really responded to the content. It wasn't so much about a brand affiliation. Kiran?
Yeah. So really, it's the story, it's the content, it's what it's doing for you, right? But a lot of people that are in here today are interested in advertising for podcasts or also thinking about if a podcast is a right fit for your brand. So there might seem like there's a bit of a disconnect there between the story and the brand, but what Kyle and I know, and a lot of the partners that we've worked with, is that those can fit together really seamlessly, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about that today. So why podcasts? Why are people interested in them from an advertising perspective? This graph behind me here today shows just what the demographic looks like of what a podcast listener in Canada is like today from 2022 numbers. So this is from the Canadian Podcast Listener Survey, which polls podcast listeners across Canada. And what they find is that Canadian podcast listeners, and this is true for actually all podcast listeners, they index higher for household income, they skew younger, they skew more diverse, and they skew more urban. So it's a highly educated, affluent, diverse group of people in a target audience that is a little bit harder to reach, right? Like people are trying to figure out how do you reach someone who maybe doesn't have cable, maybe doesn't listen to the radio or read a newspaper, and how can we kind of get in their ears, so to speak. So this is one reason. And the other reason is about the receptibility to ads. So, you hear a commercial on the TV and you change the channel, you switch the station, you close the email spam that you got. But people are really, really receptive to audio ads, specifically in podcasts. And not only are they not skipping them, but 6 in 10 podcast listeners say that they've taken some sort of action after hearing an ad, whether that means they're going to look for more information or they're buying a product or a service, right? They're actually acting on those ads. And I truly believe that the reason that they've been this successful is the fact that they're so intimate in nature, right? When you listen to a podcast ad, there's a whole variety of ways that they're done. Sometimes hosts read them, but even if they're not host read, they're written in a way that really fits the mode. And they're short. They're not super long. There's not a whole bunch generally, hopefully, especially the way we do them here at the Content Studio. And I think those two reasons combined are why you're seeing this uptick in podcast interest for brands right now. Okay, so knowing that information, what do you need to ask yourself if you're saying as a brand, I want to, either launch a podcast or I want to advertise in a podcast one way or another? These are the 5 questions that we think you should consider before embarking on that long journey that is very rewarding, but also time intensive. So all these questions kind of meld together. There isn't one that you think of before, but actually you should be thinking of them holistically. The first one is always audience. Who is your audience? So as I mentioned in the 2 slides before, that's kind of the target audience that podcasts are really, really good at connecting with. That doesn't mean that's the only audience, but you should think about, does my audience listen to podcasts, right? And if they don't listen to podcasts, should I be making a podcast?
Going off of that, who is your audience, understanding them, and then why is this story going to appeal to this specific audience? And why are you the right person to tell it? What sort of expertise or knowledge or wisdom do you have to impart around this specific story? Another thing to think about is why now for this story? What about the news, culture makes this the right time? Why is this story sort of top of mind? Another thing to look into, this is a very saturated space. Often the same story is being told quite a few times from multiple angles. That shouldn't turn you off. That doesn't mean you're not the right person to tell this story. But how are you going to put a unique sort of bent on this angle and think about this differently than maybe other people should? And finally, one thing to think about is, what is the life cycle of this show? Is this show going to be relevant a month from now, a week from now, even a few days from now? If you're making a podcast about the latest episode of Succession, that's probably going to do really, really well while Succession is on the air. There might be some diminishing returns as that show goes off the air for longer periods of time. So just something to think about, what is going to be the life cycle of my show.
Mm-hmm. And when you're thinking about the story you're going to tell, you're also thinking how much brand integration feels authentic. So can I fit my brand into this storytelling in a way that works? Or is it distracting? And so the way we do things at the content studio, and it's a little bit different everywhere, but we divide our podcasts into 2 types. So there's either custom editorial podcasts, which means it's an editorial Globe and Mail podcast, and advertisers sign on to the top line concept. So Stress Test is a podcast about personal finance for Gen Z and millennials, right? And so an advertiser will see that top line concept, and then they get 100% share of voice in the advertising slots in it. But you can also do a branded podcast, and a branded podcast would be, we work with you to create your own podcast that works with the story you're trying to tell, and we can maybe integrate, your experts in it as well. But before you're deciding which one to do in that sense, it's really about thinking about the story and the audience and what feels right for the right fit for you. And sometimes less is more. We've seen a lot of success with our editorial podcast because people are really gravitating towards the story, and then they're viewing the brand very favorably because they have that brand alignment or helping that show become possible. So we see a real recognition about those shows and who the sponsor is, and it plays very favorably for brands.
How much work and labor and resources is going to be involved in making a podcast? The number one piece of feedback I usually get from new producers or peers or other people in this space that are new to it is, that was a lot of fun. It was a lot more work than I thought it would be. Technology has made podcasting much more accessible. It's made it more affordable. These are all amazing things. But at the end of the day, there's still a fairly high production standard that most people are going to expect from a podcast, both editorially and technically. And to reach that standard and not create a barrier to entry for some listeners, there is going to have to be a fair amount of time and resources and expertise involved. So think about the things that you think you can take on yourself and the things that you're going to need to outsource.
And finally, last but not least, definitely not least, I will stress that, is how will you promote the show? Some people, the biggest mistake I've seen made in podcasting is you spend all this time, all this money, all these resources on creating this really great show, but you don't think about promotion until the show's out there. And there's so many podcasts out there, right? Like, look at everyone's hands that went up on what they're listening to and who's listening daily. There are constantly new shows going out there. If you don't have a promo plan in your pre-production plans, the chances of your show reaching all of that intended audience is very slim. So think about who you can partner with, what resources you have to promote the show, whether it's social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, whatever makes sense for you and your brand. But also, can you do feed swaps? Can you buy audio ads on other shows? All of those sorts of things. It's really, really important to have that promotion plan integrated into your production process. And with that, that's it.